An exploration of literary terms. A lot of the words that you're going to find that we're using under this category are probably pretty familiar. Obviously, some are going to be super specific to literature. Some are Latin and things like that. But overall, you're probably going to find that quite a few are things you've heard of before. So we include those because we are going to have specific definitions in terms of literature, in terms of fiction, in terms of poetry. And that is going to show in terms of the midterm versus the final exam, when you may see some of the same words show up, but with slightly different definitions depending on what form we're looking at. So part one of both exams is going to be literary terms, and there will be 15 words or phrases, and they are 2 points each. So what are we expecting to see when we just give you that word and some space to write down some points? We generally look for these particular ideas. We want some sort of definition. It could be a paraphrase. We're not citing it, even if we come up with the perfect exactly what was written down in, say, a textbook or a dictionary, but we're just aiming to share those ideas. So a paraphrase or perfectly is fine either way. No need to cite it. We want to give some sort of example. So like, where could we see this term? Where could we show a really good, clear example? And finally, why have that? Why is it significant? How does that information help us understand a story or process what that story is doing? There are lots of different ways to do that, as you can imagine. There isn't one specific perfect ID. So when I talk about these in different areas of the class, I like to give you definitions in terms of the book or in terms of really good dictionary definitions that are focused on literature, but I don't like to go so far as to give all possible examples or describe significance. I try to give a couple of sort of directions to take it, but I don't want you to feel pressured to do exactly what example struck me as valuable at a specific moment in time. I like to give you several ideas from multiple examples in our book. And I really want you to pick your own because I want it to be something that you're comfortable. Sorry, we're doing this with a bulldog. Are you helping, Matilda? Thanks, Matilda. So I want you to look at the stories, the poems as we go through the class and say, oh, I want to use that example because that one really sticks with me or really connects to sort of how I'm viewing this particular topic. So these parts are going to stay the same. They're generally going to follow a certain sort of scope, but you should get to pick your own. If you feel like you're not sure that your example is great or you're not sure if that significance is what I'm aiming for, don't hesitate to send me a message or even start a thread in the student lounge because it's really helpful for you and for everyone else. So let's try some where we take the PowerPoint examples that are excessive. Please know they are excessive, that I'm giving you sort of like, 150% there, and I don't expect that on an exam. I'm just trying to show you like how far you could go with it if you had time to write it down and use an open book. So in our first example for a traditional ID, I give a definition, I give lots of examples, I have lots of details here, and then I'm going to show you a slide where I take, a third of it and show you that, yes, a third of this whole entire thing would be more than enough. So we could say plot is the, quote, arrangement of the actions, end quote, which is in Mays in A70 in the appendix. It occurs in 5 stages. Those are exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and conclusion. An example that encompasses all 5 stages in a compacted form could be Hills Like White Elephants by Ernest Hemingway. The 5 stages make a complete story. While Hemingway compresses the conclusion, it's still present. When a story does not have a conclusion, we recognize that something is missing. Rather than having a feeling, we now know what is wrong and why we're reacting the way we are, which is the purpose of a lot of these. So what if we take that down a notch and just give sort of some of the basics and show that we could do just as well with a lot less? Plot is the arrangement of the action. You notice I'm not quoting it, even though it is a direct quote there. It's just working on remembering those details, and I know and you know that you have been working with this particular textbook. In James Baldwin's Sonny's Blues, the plot starts in media res or in the middle before it covers all 5 stages. A story needs a plot to make sense. That's more than good enough. In fact, I wouldn't necessarily expect that you would say 5 stages. But some of these parts, giving 2 or 3 indicators is a great, great step. I also want to say here, which you'll probably hear me say in lots of different videos, never leave an short answer response empty. So when you see that empty space and you're like, oh, I don't know what to say, I don't know, I don't I don't remember this term, I don't know about this. Look at the rest of the exam. You may find some details in questions that are asked later. You may find details in um, multiple choice questions. There are lots of ways that an exam will give you clues in other areas, but also just write something. Just write something. Think of a story or a poem we've read, just write something down, because if it is blank, the only thing I can do is put a 0. Because there's absolutely nothing for me to work with. If you write something and you get close, or you're wrong, or you tried, then I can attempt to give you some of those points. So aim to get some of those points. Never leave it blank. Here is another example. When I was talking about epiphanies, I talked about the definition, of course. It's a sudden realization of truth, often inspired by a seemingly simple or commonplace event. That was in A65 for Mays. And then I talk about some examples and some other definitions. It could also be called an aha moment. It can be a loss of innocence. James Joyce is even in the definition here. His collection, The Dubliners, shows epiphanies for young and old. If we looked at it from Christian theology, it would be titled A Manifestation of the Divine. One person's epiphany could be silly or simple to another person, but these mental growth spurts happen for all of us, and they're pretty random. So how would we turn that into an actual ID? We could say an epiphany is a sudden realization of truth. In James Joyce's Araby, the protagonist has an epiphany as he experiences the bizarre. He realizes that he has failed and gives up, which will influence the rest of his life. So we are sharing a story that we're going to read shortly when we read Araby, and then we're exploring sort of what happens to that particular person. So let's look at some examples. One thing also that you'll notice in the bullet point here, use other terms whenever possible, because they're going to give you extra clues. So if I studied the definition for canon and then I saw that one of the words I was given was epiphany, I could say, oh, could I switch this around somehow so that I can take the knowledge I've been working on and just sort of reuse it. So a canon example could be when a consensus of scholars, teachers, and readers agree that a work has merit, it becomes canon. An example is Raymond Carver's Cathedral, about a working class man who has an epiphany about disability when he spends time with a blind man. What about this one? A third person point of view uses third person pronouns like he, she, and they. To be objective, it must also not pass judgment on the action or characters. In Shirley Jackson's The Lottery, the reader's horrified reaction is not mirrored by the matter of fact, objective narrator. So when you start making your own list, you'll find that you have lots of options. So when you start looking at it, look at the PowerPoints. What have I shared in different PowerPoints? What do you want to copy and paste from those? Look at what you like to study. So for instance, I tend to write down bullet points. In terms of sort of memorizing all the words, I really struggle with that. I do better if I write down a couple of bullet points that sort of direct me, and then when I sit down to write, I think of those bullet points and I write it down as a paragraph. But when I studied with people, I found out that I'm really weird and that most people don't do that. So I want you to realize that you should explore some different approaches. Maybe writing it down as a paragraph really works for you. Maybe sticking to 1 or 2 stories is really helpful to you. Maybe doing lots of different stories is helpful. Like, start to play with that and ask questions and sort of see what works for you. If I go down the list of the exam and you have used 2 stories for every possible one, that's cool. It's probably going to work. I tried to show you that a lot of things are in lots of different stories. You'll notice that I tried to use Raymond Carver's Cathedral a fair number of times because it's not within any section. It's just in the introduction. So you can do that. It's completely up to you. If I see that in the exam that you've used 2 stories, I'm not going to be upset with you. I'm looking for great examples, and a lot of our stories are just going to work. It's also a great idea to use lots of different stories in terms of preparing for passage identifications and other elements of the exam. But that's completely up to you. And check the midterm and final exam videos on our course YouTube channel. There will be lists. So we have lots of literary terms, but there may be some lists that are a little bit shorter. And of course, use anything that works for you. If you want to take the definitions that are here in this particular PowerPoint, go for it. If you want to alter them as you see fit, again, go for it. There's no need to cite. So as you'll see in some of the examples, I start by showing sort of what the words are, where we could find them. These aren't right now, but you'll see the different ideas. This helps me know what week is going to have the stronger examples. And then some of these I've written down actual ones ready to go. They are sort of examples ready to go forward. Others just have a definition or some notes. So it's up to you to decide how you want all of these to look and what examples you want to use. But literary terms are important here, and they're important in lots of classes because we are, again, looking at words in different ways. The way we use a word in, say, psychology versus math versus literature, it may be just one particular word, but we add a certain nuance or emphasis to it based on the particular topic we are discussing at that point in time. So since these are something you will probably find in a lot of classes, I want them to be something you get really comfortable with before you head off into doing all college classes. So try them out, see what works for you in terms of examples, short, long, what pieces. Don't hesitate to send me examples and say, hey, would this work? And then we can have discussions about them, or as well to post them in the student lab.